A Plague Tale Innocence is a compelling journey through 14th century plague-infected Europe with a story that keeps your attention and gameplay that elevates itself and its mechanics incrementally but meaningfully throughout the adventure. At the heart of it all is a tale about a brother and sister who must leave their lives of royalty to survive both the Black Death and the ever-threatening Catholic Inquisition. But its substance comes in the form of stealth and puzzle gameplay that constantly builds on itself to make each level feel fresh. The game is also beautiful at times, with a soundtrack that is foreboding and haunting, which is perfect for the situation that our main duo, Amicia and Hugo, find themselves in. However, issues with voice acting, contrived gameplay scenarios, and animations persisted throughout the roughly 12 to 15 hours it took for me to complete the game. But with that being said, Asobo Studios has still created a game that is worth experiencing because its gameplay and story are both above average, and the title isn't afraid to dip into some of the weird and crazy shit that only video games can get away with. So if you're looking just for a recommendation, I wholeheartedly encourage checking this game out, but personally, I'd aim to buy it on sale. I got it for $30, and that really felt fair to me. It felt like the right price. But if you're sticking around for the full review, welcome to By Sword, Shield, and Rat, my review of A Plague Tale Innocence. So let's kick things off by having a look at the game's presentation elements because, honestly, they're kind of a mixed bag. I'd say the game's biggest issues are within its presentation, but while they're noteworthy, they aren't deal breakers. But let's start with some of the good stuff. Graphically, the game can be visually stunning, and the most striking element is how many environments you find yourself in over the course of the adventure, and all of them are beautifully rendered. From caves reflecting the blue pools of water, to striking castle vistas, to the battlefields littered with fallen soldiers, and dense forests packed with the colors of summer and fall. All of them are gorgeous. Even if some of them show off decrepit and rundown areas, they still look good. This allows the game to maintain a fresh palette, as no area overstays its welcome, even the ones you revisit twice. Most of this praise is heaped on the environmental design, but there are some other areas that needed a bit of work. So, starting with the rats. The game was marketed around these horde encounters with tons and tons of these small pests. We'll get into the mechanical side of them later, but visually, there's an issue. When you see a group of rats off in the distance, they do look quite imposing and menacing, which is great, but up close, they look a bit rough. Now, I must admit that it's crazy that so many things can be moving on screen at once and not chug the frame rate, but still, when the rats get in close, it just looks kinda weird. Amicia and Hugo can repel rats by standing in light, and if you take just a moment of reprieve and watch them, you can see that it just looks kinda goofy. They're like running into an invisible wall. Also, hilariously, sometimes the rats get trapped in an area where they can't avoid the light, but they also can't avoid your path, so they literally just disintegrate into nothing as if the light itself has the Infinity Gauntlet and they're victims of Thanos. I mean, it's just not great. On top of that, there's issues with cutscenes, and more specifically, the character animations within some of these cutscenes. They're just a bit off-putting. I'd say this mostly applies to when characters should be running in cutscenes, yet they look so slow and sluggish. I mean, some of these situations are supposed to be life-threatening, and they look like they can't be bothered to do more than a light jog when they should be sprinting. It just doesn't look right. Another issue with these cutscenes, and I'd say the game at large, is that the sound department is kind of lacking. It feels like some sort of audio element is missing in some cutscenes, but I really can't put my finger on what it should be. More specifically, one problem is footsteps, because running and even walking don't always create the sound effect that you'd be expecting. and unfortunately this is a problem that also continues into gameplay. There will be times when enemy guards run up to you from behind and they don't make a single noise. There's no audio cue to warn the player that an enemy is coming, and then you die. And restarting is annoying because you're going to hear the same dialogue a lot and it feels like it wasn't your fault. And I mean, oh my god, there was one situation late in the game, no spoilers, but it was late in the game, where the lack of footstep audio was so egregious that I died 7 times trying to complete one small area. It frustrated me, and while it's something I wouldn't even notice if it were there, it sticks out like a sore thumb when the footsteps aren't there. But the sound design isn't all bad, and I want to highlight the music because I think it does a fantastic job of building into the hopelessness, despair, and dread that the game bathes in throughout most of its runtime. Now look, I'm not some musical genius, but I can safely say the use of string instruments was solid, and something I always enjoyed hearing. The game's main theme is probably one of the most memorable tracks I've experienced this year, and it may have been the best if not for the Y2K, a postmodern RPG's music back in January. However, I unfortunately can't lump voice acting in with that positive sentiment because I feel like it's lacking as well, although I must admit the caveat that this isn't a game that was supported with AAA money, so there's that. Honestly, it's some middle-of-the-road performance to my ears. It's serviceable, but it isn't anything revolutionary. There are plenty of scenes in which the characters should be scared shitless, but they sometimes just sound off, like they're bored or uninterested, which again, isn't great. Finally, wrapping up this presentation section by talking a little bit about the performance, and the game ran beautifully on my PS4 Pro with no frame rate drops or any bugs and glitches. It was pretty smooth sailing and turned out to be one of the best elements of the game's presentation alongside its breathtaking visuals and great music. To me, games are either more focused on their narrative or their gameplay, and for A Plague Tale Innocence, it's the former, so let's start with that. Which, of course, I'll be keeping it mostly spoiler-free. The game's story is like the Boxcar Children blended with more than just a pinch of plague. Our main playable character in the game is Amicia de Rune, a descendant of the royal de Rune bloodline, and her younger brother Hugo joins alongside her for the journey. Hugo is ailing from a mysterious blood condition at the outset of the game, and the relationship between brother and sister is very fragile. Hugo's medical condition led him to being isolated from pretty much everyone else as his mother attempted to find a cure for him. The game's main plot is set in motion when one day, while out hunting rabbits, Amicia's dog is eaten alive by some unknown force. As her and her father return home distraught, a raid is conducted on the castle by the Inquisition in order to locate Hugo and kidnap him to learn more about his blood. And again, this stuff really isn't spoilers, by the way. It happens in the first chapter of the game. But anyway, through some misfortune, Amicia and Hugo are left alone to fend for themselves, and their relationship has to begin growing. From there, the rest of the game is a journey to find out what ails Hugo and to put a stop to the Inquisition's plans. Along the way, you meet a few other characters who accompany you throughout the adventure, but most of them are pretty one-dimensional, with their defining characteristic being the profession that they've learned. However, they do offer up a nice change of pace, and they keep the story feeling fresh and moving along, and again, really, no part of the narrative really drags on for far too long. As previously mentioned, the two driving points of the plot are 1. How Amicia and Hugo go from strangers to loving siblings, and 2. Discovering the mystery of Hugo's ailment. Starting with the former, I'd say that the connection and dynamic between the two siblings is pretty good, although fairly basic. It's your standard tale of two distant and different people becoming closer through a shared experience in a dangerous world. It pretty much follows the cliche arc of not really knowing or liking each other, to learning to appreciate each other, to a big fallout, and then ending with a huge reconciliation. The cliche nature of it isn't helped by the fact that the writing isn't as strong as it could have been, but honestly, it's passable. It's not bad, but it's not outstanding either. Wholesome, perhaps, is the best word for this story. But addressing the second major plot driver now, Hugo's condition is really where the game dips into the absurdity that really only video games can get away with. Now, I don't want to spoil anything here, but what starts as a seemingly grounded and realistic story quickly evolves into one with supernatural implications. It gets bizarre, and again, I really don't want to spoil anything. For me, when the larger-than-life story beats were first introduced, it took me completely out of the story, but once I got to experience the gameplay ramifications of this, I appreciated it a lot more, and I actively enjoyed it by the credits. And if you know what happens at the end of this game, you know what I'm talking about. I'd say the weakest part of the story, though, has to be the way the game handles its main villain, the head of the Inquisition. It takes a really long time to even see him, and once you do get a proper introduction, it can still be quite challenging to understand his goals or motivations. He's underdeveloped and one-dimensional, which easily makes him one of the weakest characters. The game really doesn't do a good job showing you what exactly he intends to do until he does it, and by then, the game is nearly over. So, in summary, the story holds your interest. That's the best way I can say it. It keeps the plot moving along at a healthy pace and throws a few curveballs at you throughout, and those elements help elevate it above its sometimes weak writing and its one-trick pony of a villain, and also the cliche structure that the narrative follows. Moving on to gameplay now, and there's quite a bit to discuss, but let's start with the overall structure. The game is a linear adventure that incorporates mostly stealth, but also a pinch of puzzle elements as well. The game is comprised of 17 levels, some of which are completed in as little as 10 minutes, with others lasting more than an hour. Each level sees Amicia, Hugo, and whatever other characters are currently with them moving through areas that, for the most part, appear to be a lot more open than they truly are, which is the mark of a good world design. On the flip side though, I must admit, a ton of these levels feel very video gamey at their fundamental mechanic level. But we'll get to that in a bit. Stealth is really the driving force of the gameplay when it comes to interactions with human enemies, while puzzle solving is the defining characteristic in sections with the chaotic hordes of rats. But let's start with stealth. Amicia and her comrades are weak, and they go down in one hit. Guards are often faster than Amicia too, meaning that if you're spotted, death is almost assured, but not guaranteed thanks to the inclusion of a sling that allows our hero to dispatch enemies with rocks. At the beginning of the title, Amicia's offensive capabilities are pretty weak, meaning that sneaking around, using tall grass, and luring guards by throwing objects are some of the best strategies. And it's fairly dull, to be honest, because at this point in this console generation, we have had so many games where you sneak through tall grass and then you lure a guard away by throwing an object. We've done it a ton of times in a bunch of different games. We've gotten to the point where it feels so stale to stand in some tall shrub, chuck a rock, and have brain-dead guards investigate every single time they hear the slightest noise. It's unrealistic, and it's overplayed. However, this game elevates itself above this mediocre baseline as early as the quarter mark, and it does it in a few ways. First, Amicia is able to upgrade her sling and equipment through a crafting element that has been very thoughtfully implemented into the game. Collecting resources across levels allows her to boost her sling speed, and at the same time, companions will often give you new types of ammo that can increase Amicia's offensive capabilities. Stealth is still the best route forward, but it allows Amicia to be more of a threat, which aligns nicely with the coming-of-age narrative beats that define her growth. The crafting element is also two-pronged, as resources are needed to both upgrade the sling, but also to craft the various ammo types. It leads to a really nice risk and reward component because you, as a player, have to make meaningful choices on if you want to sacrifice your ammo count for better equipment or vice versa. Second, the game boosts its stealth gameplay by allowing each companion to have a unique ability that can be used at various times. For example, one character can pick locks, while another can dispatch guards. It's very basic stuff, but it's still appreciated in the sense that it offers some variation. But of course, the game's biggest marketing mechanic was its introduction of thousands of rats, all hell-bent on stripping our characters of their skin and flesh. These tiny creatures are used frequently, which is really good. However, I gotta admit that sometimes they appear in the most comical ways. I mean, this moment where they pour out like a waterfall had me geeking and rolling. I mean, what is this? It looks so goofy. They just keep flowing out of this thing. But anyway, these rodent moments are where the game's puzzly nature really makes itself known. Basically, the rats will pursue you endlessly and kill you quickly unless you're guarded within the confines of light. The rats will not enter any area that is well illuminated, which implies they are afraid of it. However, as previously mentioned, they will run right up to it as if there's an invisible wall blocking them from entering it. I can't get over it. It's really off-putting. Anyway, this creates a lot of scenarios in which Amicia needs to transport herself, her brother, or her friends from one side of the map to the other while using light to avoid the beasts. And these sections are some of the most contrived in the game, as it's incredible how lucky Amicia is to always discover a way to move forward. This is supposed to be a very grounded world, and it just feels so mechanical in design most of the time, and everything is super convenient. I mean, there's points where you venture into the nest of the rats, and there's bundles of sticks with light torches all over the place, and it's like, what are these doing down here? Who came into this nest and lit these torches, and how have they stayed lit for this long? I mean, it makes no sense, but the game has to give you some way to advance with a fire, so voila! Like magic, it's there for you to use. It really takes you out of the world and breaks the immersion, but at the same time, I'm not really sure how they could have avoided this issue while leaving the rats in, and to be clear, they definitely needed to leave the rats in, so it's a concession that I'm willing to make. But some of the best levels in the game are the ones that combine sections with human enemies and rat enemies, because it leads to some fun interactions. Rats can often be used to deter or eliminate guards in some of the later areas, and it's so much more satisfying than hiding, distracting with the throw of a stone, and sneaking past. It's in some of these endgame levels where all the game's mechanics and ideas are allowed to mesh together, and by the end of it all, Amicia is much more offensive than defensive, and these two elements raised my overall enjoyment with the title. The gameplay ends up being so much more satisfying than is originally outlined in the first level, and I think that's a huge plus for this title. So wrapping this thing up now, I do have a lot of problems with this game, but honestly, none of them were severe enough to stop it from being one of my favorite games of the year so far. It really is a solid addition to the roster of titles I've already experienced this year. Its core gameplay loop is ever expanding to include more ideas and more concepts that flesh it out in meaningful ways. The story, while lackluster at times, keeps you interested to see what will happen next, and the pace it moves at ensures you never have to wait too long. The lack of big publisher funding does mean that the presentation dips a bit, but honestly, it really does seem like they squeezed the most out of all the resources that they had. So overall, A Plague Tale Innocence is a game I really enjoyed, and if you can get it on sale, it's all the better. I'd say it's worth a purchase, no doubt in my mind. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter @NopeNapNarp, and as always, Have a nice day, and take care.